Hi there, welcome to the archives. So this episode is called the Some Opposites of Shame. One second, I just want to delete this section here. So I had a conversation with Gabriel Kram last week. And Gabriel, for those who don't know, I was introduced to him. He is the founder and CEO of Applied Mindfulness, Inc. He's also the co-convener of the Restorative Practices Alliance, and he's a co-founder of the Academy of Applied Social Medicine and the author of Restorative Practices of Wellbeing. I'm going to check that book out in a little bit. I'm struggling to read right now, but that's neither near here nor there. That's not the topic. Okay. Excuse the background noise if you hear it. So in our dialogue, the topic of shame came up. And Gabriel mentioned a word that I use in my research, but that I haven't touched on too tough. And that word is sovereignty. And in my mind, I was like, ding, ding, ding. Like, he nailed it. He can hold on. Because that's exactly one of the words that addresses the antidote of shame. Why? Because so much of shame is about power. Shame leaves us feeling as if we have nowhere to turn, which draws more shame, which makes us feel even more powerless. And in my dissertation, I started the introduction chapter of Parable of the Talents, Unraveling Shame, by writing the following. So I wrote, shame thrives where power is struggled for, abused, in excess, or imbalanced. Those with excess power who abuse it, like it being power, they weaponize shame to control others for personal gain. That's precisely how shame works in tandem with power to move us. Essentially, shame is all about power struggles, it's all about power imbalance, it's all about unequal power, it's about abuse of power, it's about toxic dynamics, control dynamics. An example of this that I use in the book is between Lauren and one of the characters, Harry. And essentially, she has a condition called hyperempathy syndrome. And for most of her life, her parents and her whole family made her ashamed of it. She wasn't allowed to share it with people. We know this dialogue, right? Disclosure. And again, that's not to say that keeping their medical conditions to themselves is always out of shame. But in her case, it was out of shame. Her family wanted her to keep it a secret because if she told people about it, it would basically give her parents their history away. And I'm not going to get into it because I always do spoiler alerts. But when she tells them, Harry gets really upset that she's kept this from him her whole life and asks to start reading her journal. So Harry was like, I need to read your journal. So that is a way in which he's using her shameful moment as a control dynamic to be able to leverage. Because what happens if people are watching? Why do police, why does the FBI, why do they surveillance people? Why do different countries surveillance each? Why is there cyber attacks? Because people know that once you have surveillance, once you're able to watch people, once you're able to study them, you're able to learn their patterns, you are gaining leverage. You are gaining some sort of power over them. And that's exactly what Harry does. He wants to read her journal. And like an idiot, she's like, okay. So she lets him read her journal. But those are some of the ways we can think of shame being used with power to control people. We see it right now, a lot of like fat shaming that's meant to make people lose weight, right? If you shame somebody, hopefully you're going to shame them enough that they're going to lose weight. I saw a post yesterday from the Village Auntie on single people and how we're shaming single people. Again, shame is meant to get single people to look for partners. You're supposed to feel so bad about being single that now you're gonna go find a partner and be coupled up and like be in this whole great heteronormative utopia. So shame is used for power. Okay. So in my dissertation, I use Octavia Butler's Parable of the Talents to explore some of the shame's associations with power that's interwoven with anti-Black racism and white supremacist violence. Because what happens is when shame operates in these ways, the antidote is exactly what Gabriel notes. It has to be sovereignty. It has to be this liberation, this liberatory freedom. Autonomy is another word that I talked about. An escape from bondage. Sovereignty, as in you are able to make your own decisions. You are able to make your own choices for yourself that is best for you. It's about self sustainability and not having to depend on others. No, not necessarily having to depend on others because we need interdependence, but it's not being at somebody else's mercy, right? So one of the research projects that I studied when I first started my PhD was around food sovereignty. And one of the definitions between the difference I learned between food security. So food security is ensuring that people have access to food. So a food bank would help somebody who's food insecure to have more food security, right? Having a job or providing food stamps um, that helps people with food security. It's very different from food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is ensuring that people have access to food, but they're able to also make their own food if they need to, that they're able to have access to land, that is allowing people to farm how they need to without competing with market value, without competing with big corporations. So there's a difference between having food and then being and food sovereignty, having a garden where you're able to plant your own foods, right? Where you don't need to depend on the government to give you the food security. You don't need to depend on food banks. You don't even need to depend on grocery stores necessarily because you are within your community. You guys have a nice network where there's community gardens, like there's sovereignty. That's what I mean by sovereignty here. So sovereignty is the opposite of shame, and there are other opposites of shame. So Jack Halberstam talks about pride as the opposite of shame, although he asks us to be very careful of how we enact and engage in pride, because if our pride doesn't come with an awareness of shame, meaning if we try to separate shame from pride and refuse to understand that pride is the same, pride and shame are both different sides of the same coin, then we risk a superficial sort of pride that really just is an overcompensation for not addressing our shame, right? So if you're like, yeah, I'm so, we have black pride, white pride, you could think about LGBTQ pride, there's so many different forms of pride. Um, I can be a very prideful person, the proud family, but if you are not able to look at your shame as well too, then what is happening is you're basically performing hyper superiority with a deep inferiority complex that's just being masked and hidden. So Melisa Harris-Parry also talks about recognition as an antidote to shame because shame is all about misrecognition, right? So when you misrecognize somebody, it causes them shame. What is the opposite? You recognize them. You see them for who they are. Brené Brown says that vulnerability and belonging are the antidote because shame leaves us disconnected and fearful of vulnerability. So in this way, connection is an opposite of shame. I go as far to bring in truth and reconciliation, and yes, in the Indigenous context here, um, truth and reconciliation as the opposite of shame. Again, reconciliation talks about the connection part, the belonging, the vulnerability, but then also truth. So in the literature, it talks about how when European settlers first came to Turtle Island, they thought that Indigenous and Native communities here didn't have any shame because they didn't blush, right? And so because Native people didn't blush because their skin was a little bit darker, didn't have fair skin like the white Europeans, the Europeans thought that they didn't have shame. How we went from framing them as having no shame to being shameful, that's a whole another conversation. I also raise truth here because so much of shame is about covering, it's about hiding, it's about lying, it's about masking, and it's about performing. So if we want to do the opposite of shame, we have to engage in truth, radical honesty, and then lastly, knowledge, awareness, self reflection, introspection. These are all practices that are the opposite of shame. Because in Trauma and its Institutional Destinies, Karen Ball wrote this in 2000. They share that for Jean Paul Sartre, shame resulted in self consciousness, whereas, and then Virginia Woolf also said that shame provides insight into power dynamics, right? So if you are able to self reflect, if you are able, if you are able to self reflect, if you are able to be introspective, shame allows you to raise your consciousness. It gives you more information, and all of these allow you to see into the different power dynamics. I was talking today about another post I want to do where talking about how shame is very political and actually really beneficial for women specifically. When I was in so much shame, that was when I was most easily manipulated. People were exerting all sorts of power over me. I was meek. I didn't speak up for myself. I was being walked all over. That's not to say that much has changed. But now, as I continue to heal my shame, I'm able to set different boundaries, although I still have a lot of work to do. I don't, I see different things much more clearly. I'm able to step more into my power. So, um, Layla Delia talks about taking, she remembered who she was and she took back her power. That process of remembering who you are is a lot of it has to do with healing your shame. So I also wanted to note that this aspect of shame that leads to like enlightenment and consciousness raising, it was also found in like ancient Greece, which means it was found in ancient Egypt, as well as China. So studies have shown that shame was featured prominently in shaping seminal texts in Greek and Chinese philosophy, as well as in other intellectual lives, including the book of Genesis in the Bible, right? So we have the story of Adam and Eve. That is a story of shame that essentially is able to teach us a lesson. There's a moral to that story. She should have never ate the apple. Now, guess what? They're all naked. The snake is here. Like, we got it. So those are some examples of the opposites of shame. So this is getting long. I'm going to wrap it up. To summarize, shame causes us to seek power over others. It creates unequal balance, power struggles. Its forceful nature makes us want to control others in disastrous ways. And sovereignty is needed as an antidote. So is belonging, so is connection, so is pride, so is recognition, so is truth, so is reconciliation, so is consciousness, raising, awareness, all of that. Okay? And until next time, in solidarity.